Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Professor Hans Gutbrod, who is a professor at Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Welcome, Professor Gutbrod.
Thank you.
We are observing since months tensions and mass protests in Georgia on the streets of Tbilisi, where hundreds of thousands of people protested for months against the new law, which the government calls foreign agents law, and the protesters call Russia's law. And now the law has not been only adopted, it was rejected, vetoed by the president, and the parliament has overridden this veto. So the law is now adopted in the end phase. What does it mean for Georgia, and what is the perspective of this conflict? The conflict is not gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, I think, to zoom out on, and what effectively is happening is that this law is part of a much larger unlawful seizure of power by a small clique of people that are in charge of the country. So this law is part of this takeover and makes it possible to repress essentially any civil society organization, all the way across to, let's say, private schools, animal charities, people that help those with disability. All of those are thrown under supervision and exposed to punitive fines, exposed to intrusion. And civil society was the one sector that was, so to speak, still left standing after the courts had been taken over, education had been taken over, the key other regulatory institutions, including the National Bank and the Central Election Commission, had been taken over. And so civil society is now essentially put under this kind of control also. So this is the big picture. And it's very important to understand, again, that when people refer to a law on the transparency of foreign influence, what actually we have to talk about is a coup, an unlawful seizure of power.
But that is the argument which the Georgian government and those who defend this new law, they always use. They say, look, in the United States, there is a far legislation. You need to have a certain label. If you get foreign financing, it's not that bad. If you get only under 20% of your financing from abroad, it's still okay in Georgia. So it's not an issue, not a big deal. How much of substance is in this argumentation?
There's very little substance in this argumentation. I myself ran a transparency campaign to increase the transparency of think tanks. So I've worked with many think tanks around the world, and we've made tens of millions of research funding more transparent. Now, the first thing that you have to say is that NGOs in Georgia actually were among the most transparent in the world. So if you go on the website of Transparency International, within something like 15 seconds, you can find out who funds them, with how much money, and for what project. So this transparency in that sector had been quite good. By contrast, government transparency in recent years has actually overall gone down. So the argument that you need more NGO transparency is a canard. And the problem with the law is not that you want transparency. In the end, most of us want transparency in most parts of our lives, not in all parts of our lives, private lives, but most of us want transparency. The problem is that the law has lots of opportunity for arbitrariness. So let's say you declare 1 lari, as a Georgian currency is called, wrong. That's about 30 cent, so to speak, euro cent. The fine that you will be given if a fault is found for 1 lari is automatically 10,000 lari. So the fines don't scale up proportionately, but straight up the fine is 10,000 lari. And so this is just one of the many indications that this law has vindictive and vicious intent. The law is also, I should add, there are several other components that allow arbitrariness. The law is partially retroactive for the year 2023, and the law also there's been added, and this hasn't even received that much attention, extensive power of intrusion. So the government could now come to any private citizen or any company and institution and say, give us the communication that you have had that we think might relate to transparency of foreign influence. Give us, the government could come to me and say, give us all the communications you've had with Sergej. And if I refuse that, the fine, which will not be set by the court, but straight out by the supervisory institution, is going to be 5,000 lari. That is more than the base salary of a cabinet minister in Georgia. So that's, it's more than 2,000 euro. So clearly, while you write, you can write transparency on the outside of a tank, that doesn't make that tank transparent. Yeah, this is still an instrument to run people over with and to run over the rights of citizens in Georgia.
What is the outcome now? What is the perspective for the next months? Georgia has elections in October this year. So what you have described and what people from opposition say, they are afraid that Russian experience of cracking down on the civil society will be used, and before the elections, the public discussion will be silenced, and institutions, NGOs, or free media, which could have criticized the ruling party, would be silenced. What is the perspective for any success of the opposition? They don't have their representation in the parliament enough. Presidential veto has been overridden. Protests do not help, obviously. Is Georgia lost?
Let's put it this way. I would talk about Georgian opposition parties. That's very important, because rather than the opposition, because the parties include a very broad spectrum that includes people like the former president Saakashvili, whom many people do not want to come back to power. But it also includes people that until a few years ago were part of the government. And this is also important to say to people internationally, that when you think, well, surely the government is legitimized to do, they've been elected, they're legitimized to do that. Well, one of the people that firmly opposed this law is the prime minister that was heading up the party when it won the last election in 2021. So we have a broad spectrum of people that have never been on the side of the Georgian dream, and very many people, and also I would say very many good people that have been inside earlier iterations of the Georgian dream government that had much more space for a pro-Western and kind of, if you will, broadly speaking, modernizing and democratic agenda. So how those people constitute themselves for this upcoming election, that remains to be seen. They're taking their time, which I think makes sense under the circumstances. Classically, you could say that elections in Georgia were very rarely a level playing field. They were always skewed with administrative resources, with many voters that live on a subsistence level. And now we see that the level of the playing field is even more skewed, and it's going to be even more of an uphill struggle. Here is what will be very challenging for and I will call it a regime, the Georgian dream regime at this point. They have clearly demonstrated that they've run out of ideas, substantial ideas that they can offer to the Georgian people. The claim that they had in the past, that they ran a more democratic country and more open and with less police repression, that is gone. About 100 people that were in police detention were very badly beaten. Not all very badly, but were beaten after they came into detention, with some people very grievously injured. We have essentially a breakdown of the constitutional order. So the argument now that you can make from the side of the opposition parties is that this isn't about a substantive program in one way or the other, and it's not even about one party against other parties. It's about either you want a proper state and a kind of functional, institutional, and constitutional order where also the rights of citizens are protected, or you have the whims of one man. It's not even one-man rule, because it's the whims and the projections and the paranoias of one man that actually determine everything. Now, what we know is that a lot of people that supported the Georgian dream we know this from surveys, are deeply uneasy about where the government is going. They didn't sign up for this. This is not what they were hoping for. And so in its own way, because of a particular radical wrecking course that the government has gone on, they're taking at least a very large bet in terms of what's to come.
Wow, that sounds really scary. We are talking to Hans Gutbrod, who is a professor at Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss interviews like that. And if you think that you need to share this video with someone who needs to know more about what is going on in Georgia, feel free to do it. And I would like to go one layer deeper and ask you, Professor Gutbrod, what is the goal? What is the aim of Georgia's dream? You have already said that it is about one man's dream and projections. Is it about oligarch Ivanishvili wants to be a sort of dictator, Georgian Lukashenko or Georgian Putin?
Mr. Ivanishvili is a very particular individual. He's reclusive. He doesn't like to be out in public, and he doesn't even seem to enjoy power in particular. He's secluded by the Black Sea. Very few people have access to him. And so the final motivations about his decisions, even the members of the party, of his own party, and even the parliamentarians don't fully know. The communications they receive are intermittent, and they're top-down directives. There isn't a broader discussion with that. Now, there's clearly an aspect of it, of what's going on, that's geopolitical. At the same time, we also see that Mr. Ivanishvili has kind of caught himself up in a number of his own projections and fears, and that are maybe best explained as something akin to Macbeth, that he worries that there's a global conspiracy coming for him, that he sees all sorts of ominous signs, that he talks about a global war party that is out to get him in particular. Now, the very bad news is for Georgia is that this could spell, as it says in Macbeth, this could spell a period of violent sorrow, a period of really being under immense strain and of violence and even of violent repression also, taken to its most extreme. On the other hand, what we also seem to be seeing is there isn't a strategic genius at work. Until very recently, you could have made the argument that maybe Mr. Ivanishvili was just was very good at playing a balancing game. That he was in a tough spot in the world, that on the one hand you brought in China, you somehow were respectful of the wishes of the Kremlin, and on the other hand you connected with Europe and all the while maintained a good relationship with Azerbaijan. Well, balancing is only balancing if you actually balance. If you kind of toss the Europeans and the West that have been pretty consistent friends to Georgia, if you toss them out of the boat, then you're not really balancing. And so the motivation, I still find it most plausible that while there is a degree of strategic calculation, we're also seeing the result of a man who's caught up with a specter of his own projections and sees ghosts in places where rational people cannot actually see anything.
But this sounds like Russia is the country which enjoys the development most. The European Union has already said that Georgia should at least the accession process of Georgia into the EU, or the process of harmonization between the EU and Georgia, should be stopped. And that is what Russia actually says. It's fine for us. Georgia will be more bonded to us. How much of Russia is behind all this process?
Well, I think there are almost two levels, and one level that's really important to your listeners. If Russia prevails in Ukraine, this will come to your neighborhood. So this is directly matters as a kind of approach of strongmen that are going to use these tools to ensure their own grip on power. And this is why what happens in Ukraine matters, even if you think you're far away, let's say in Spain, Portugal, or similar. So there's absolutely that dimension there. One has heard from Moscow, there is reporting in the Moscow Times that many people find plausible, that the Kremlin actually has somewhat mixed feelings about what goes on in Georgia for the following reason. They, in essence, had a relatively good deal in Georgia. It was open enough that you could do a lot of transactions, that you could have some money flows through it, still respecting some anti-money laundering rules, etc. A lot of goods are coming to both to Russia and especially to Central Asia, from which they're smuggled onward to Russia, or kind of taken onwards, come through Georgia. So in some way, that halfway house was maybe not even the worst version. And you could have made the argument that having another Viktor Orban-style government inside the EU might have actually been to the benefit of Russia longer term also. Whereas now what they're seeing is that Mr. Ivanishvili is playing a high-stakes gamble, which the youth of Georgia absolutely, taking the country on a course that the youth of Georgia absolutely dislikes. 2/3 of the youth are dead set against this law. They're absolutely against that future. And to put it very crudely, this isn't a game that in the long term you can sustain. There isn't really something or it becomes very, very difficult to sustain. It's a great challenge. And Russia has enough issues on its own hands. In that way, there is a very strong Russian component in there, and there is a very strong, something that the West and people in Berlin and people in Brussels and everywhere else should pay attention to, and something that they need to think about, specifically in Georgia. This still could go either way for the Kremlin.
And what does it mean for the security in the whole region? We know that 20% of Georgia has been occupied by Russia. We're talking about Abkhazia region in the northwest of the country, and South Ossetia in the north of the country, and the division line between the occupied South Ossetia and Georgian controlled territory is just 20 or 30 miles northwest from Tbilisi. Please correct me if I'm wrong. We know that the Russians are constructing their naval base in Abkhazia on the Black Sea. And the region is not peaceful at all. We know that the tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia are not over. Around the Nagorno-Karabakh, we know that the Russians have their presence in Armenian military base. So the region is increasingly important for the security in the region. What does this tension between Ivanishvili, Georgia's dream, and Georgian society mean for the region?
Well, let's put it this way. In the past, the mantra was frozen conflicts. And the one thing that we can say is that the situation is very liquid right now. And in what way things are going to go depends on many, many different alignments. Often people think of this as Moscow versus, let's say, the Kremlin versus the West. There's also Ankara that has very strong interests, Turkey that has very strong interests, and Georgia as a transit route. Turkey has traditionally sent some of its best ambassadors to Tbilisi. Central Asia, I think, would also like to have kind of access routes that are not fully under the control, Central Asian countries that are fully under the control of Russia. And even Azerbaijan, which has in many ways collaborated quite effectively with the Kremlin in recent years, probably is also interested in that kind of corridor not being closed. Now, where all of that ends up, I think the liquidity is really the right way of putting it. It is very, very fluid, and all sorts of things could realign in various ways. That also means, and that's very important, that if for Georgians, often the way that this gets projected is, well, as long as we don't get more than statements of concern from Brussels, we're kind of lost, because Germany and other countries struggle to muster the strength to actually even project into Ukraine and defend that. If that's the way you look at it, it looks fairly bleak. If at the same time you realize that there's lots of other countries that want to keep Russia at a certain distance from here because their roads, their cargo, their pipeline, their train lines run through here, it ends up actually being still a difficult and very challenging picture, but one that offers slightly more opportunity, geopolitical opportunities also.
What additional leverage Russia has in the region besides the occupied territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, are power grids, gas supply, these traditional leverages which Russia uses not only in the countries of Caucasus, but in other countries in the region?
Well, I mean, what's important to say is Russia has, in recent years, has already been very present. So as people that follow the region know that if you were in the opposition, in the Russian opposition, and living in Tbilisi, you might leave for a weekend to Istanbul, and then suddenly you couldn't come back. So clearly, lists that came from the Russian authorities were integrated with the lists that people checked when you came into the country. So in that way, there's already has been quite some presence and projection into the authorities in the region. So presence of security service absolutely matters. Of course, what is changing overall and longer term is that there's almost a shift of the kinds of business that get done in Georgia. The private sector is not very strong, but chunks of the private sector were trying to modernize. Some of the big banks were listed in the London Stock Exchange. There are attempts to have transparent corporate governance, etc. And many of these things are going to change in the future. What's very important to say is that there is no ambivalence about what the overwhelming majority of Georgians want. They're not unfriendly to an individual Russian that they meet, but they absolutely know what it means to live in a Kremlin-style country and in what the contemporary Russia is like, unlike many people in the West that maybe think, oh, I don't particularly like vaccinations, or I don't like pharmaceutical companies, or I don't like the German government. Therefore, I think that something like Vladimir Putin is the solution. This is these kind of people that genuinely think that in Georgia, you could put them into a very small football. I'm not even going to say stadium. Yeah, I mean, you're numbering a couple of hundred people, maybe a few thousand people that genuinely believe that. There's some that within the culture wars aren't entirely sure where they're going to be. But the actual Russia supporters, they didn't manage to clear the 5% threshold in the last election. It's absolutely marginal.
And what does it mean, the development in this society and these growing repressions which you have described? What does it mean for the foreigners who stay in Georgia? Do foreign experts feel sort of pressure, or is it only something which happens only within the Georgian society when the government tries to silence Georgian citizens?
It's primarily, the main focus is, of course, indeed Georgian citizens, but let's say you will meet a respected lawyer, highly respected lawyer, who's also active a little bit in civil society. You will meet him on a Friday afternoon during daytime, carrying a pepper spray in his hand already, not in his pocket, in his hand, because they need to be worried that some gangs, some titushki, as they're called in this region, some gangs of people are going to assault him. And he doesn't say that theoretically, a few days earlier, this lawyer had a friend stay over, a former ambassador, no less, who on his way home was assaulted by a group of people who beat him very, very badly and injured him quite badly. So this is something that's very present. Let's look at the flip side of this. In the past, there often was the view that the youth is politically disengaged, didn't really know what's going on. The youth of Georgia now is mostly mobilized. They have a very, very good idea of what they want. And they also have a very, very good idea of what the EU stands for. This is something that, and maybe a better idea than many, many people inside the EU who take everything for granted and think that, oh, the fact that there's peace, etc., that's obvious. And I think people in Georgia understand that the EU stands for something better. It stands for not having to worry that you're going to be beaten up, that your parents might be called and threatened, that even your little daughter, underage daughter, is going to be called and threatened on the phone. So in that way, there's where this ends up, we don't know. But it's also clear that there are people that with real patriotism and with real commitment to both Georgia and to Europe and to their own democracy are very, very courageous. So there's that really very remarkable aspect also.
And that is, of course, a sign that the fight for democracy is an eternal fight. You can never be sure that your democratic state order is being finally protected. Georgia had experienced this revolution before, like with a lot of civil society groups working on creation of democratic society. Now we see, like 2 decades after, total like backslide and development, which is nothing but scary. We have talked to Professor Hans Gutbrod, who teaches at the Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Thank you, Professor Gutbrod, for your insights. Take care, stay safe, and thank you again for your information.
Thank you very much.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will never miss interviews like this. And if you know a person who wanted to know what is happening in Georgia and why it's important for everyone in Europe and worldwide, feel free to share this link with them. And stay safe, stay with Ukraine, stay free.